In March of 1912, a cyclone rolls out of the Timor Sea and drives straight into the northwest coast of Australia. Within hours, one of the most modern steamships in the country has vanished, taking about 150 passengers and crew to the bottom, without a single distress call reaching the shore. Their loss still stands as Australia's worst weather-related maritime disaster of the entire 20th century. Yet the Koombana's story remains shrouded in obscurity, raising questions about why such a tragedy faded from national memory. That silence is part of the mystery, because more than a century later, the Koombana is still listed as missing. No hull has ever been located, no bell, no anchor, no boiler. Days passed before anyone even knew she was overdue, because the only voice the ship had was its wireless, and that voice went quiet within hours of her leaving the harbor. The scattered wreckage that did float up, a stateroom door, a plank from a lifeboat, a cushion, told the search parties almost nothing about where she sank or how. The cause was never settled either, and for 100 years, the blame has bounced between the storm and the men who sailed her. What looks like a closed case starts to crack the moment you read the record closely. A court of marine inquiry blamed the cyclone, and that single verdict locked the story into place for decades. But the witnesses who actually stood on the jetty at Port Hedland and watched her leave that morning described a departure the official report chose not to dwell on, and their testimony opens a hole straight through the middle of the accepted account. Inside that final morning sits a small fact, noted once and then quietly dropped, and it changes how the entire loss has to be read. Everyone after 1912 accepted the easiest explanation, the storm, and that is precisely where the real story was hiding. So we follow the evidence past the point where the inquiry stopped, and we follow the people who were really there. But before the sea took the Koombana, one quiet decision aboard set the whole disaster in motion. The Koombana was built to be indestructible. She came off the slipway in Glasgow in 1908 as a steel steamer of 3,668 gross tons, 340 feet long, with triple expansion engines pushing 3,000 horsepower. She left the Clyde that winter in a snowstorm, and the following year, she carried Western Australia's premier up the coast to open the brand new jetty at Port Hedland. Her work was the long coastal run, and she did it wrapped in mahogany, satinwood, and electric light. For 3 years, she ran that route as close to clockwork as any ship of her class. Her builders boasted of her in the way Edwardian shipyards did, with hard numbers. Every compartment had a watertight door. She could flood herself with 900 tons of ballast for stability, and her cold rooms held 800 tons of frozen cargo. Her steering had 4 separate methods of control. Her stability was calculated out to a 90-degree heel, and her propeller shaft was forged 25% stronger than the rules demanded. She carried wireless telegraphy when that was still a genuine novelty, and 4 Babcock boilers could hold 14.5 knots under a full load. Her saloons berthed 300 passengers, and the shipyards measured her accommodation against the great Atlantic liners of the age. Naval architects called her too good for the trade she worked, a high-grade liner wasting itself on a bare coastal run. She was the pride of the Adelaide Steamship Company, and the very first vessel ever to tie up at Port Hedland's new jetty. In 3 years on that run, she scraped sandbanks more than once, ran aground, even caught fire twice, and every time she steamed away under her own power. The men who sailed her called her a good seaboat, and nothing about her engineering said the ocean could break her. Every plate and every rivet was drawn to survive the worst the weather could serve up. And yet, the sea around Port Hedland has a reputation that even the finest steel could not outrun. Long before the Koombana, the men who worked that coast had a name for it, and it wasn't a compliment. They called it the Cyclone Coast. Between 5 and 7 tropical storms slam into the shoreline every year. hurricanes born in the warm Timor Sea that wheel south and cross the land between Derby and Carnarvon. The reefs along that shore catch whatever the storms leave behind, and since the records only began with white settlement, the early losses are counted in fragments. The register of wrecks along this coastline reads like a century of serial tragedy. Between 1856 and 1876, at least 8 vessels were driven onto the teeth of Ningaloo Reef alone, 12 miles of coral that has been breaking hulls since the first explorers charted it. Then, in April 1887, a single cyclone caught the purling fleet, anchored off the 90-mile beach near the De Grey River, and wrecked more than 40 boats in one night, killing divers by the hundreds. Survivors described masts breaking like matchwood, and one schooner, the Dawn, vanishing with 60 men aboard before anyone could reach her. The death estimates from that single storm ran past 500, and in November 1910, barely a year before the Koombana's final season, another cyclone tore through Broome, killed more than 40 people, and destroyed much of the shipping still riding at anchor in the harbor. The coast itself makes every one of those storms worse. Port Hedland sits at the head of a harbor so shallow that ships only move in near high tide, and the tide there swings a full 9 meters. Reefs, shifting sandbars, and an open anchorage turn ordinary gales into traps, and the dash of open water near Bedout Island was dreaded by seamen, even in clear weather. So when the Koombana's captain stepped aboard that morning, he already knew exactly what kind of water he was sailing into. Frank Allen had spent 3 decades on the water, and this was not his first cyclone season. He'd been master of the Koombana for years, long enough to think of her deck under his feet as routine. Out of Broome, the work was never done, cargo waiting on the wharf, schedules already slipping, and a man who makes his living on time makes the call he's told to make. The telegraph office in Port Hedland had the storm on the wire, a low-pressure system churning in from the Indian Ocean. But the barometer was still steady on the morning of the 20th, the sky holding its breath. Allen did not sail because he was reckless. He sailed because the day looked fine, and the warning was still just a rumor on the horizon. He ordered the hold finished and got underway before noon, pointed north toward Broome and a stretch of coast with no harbor and no mercy. If the weather closed in, he knew the play. Ride it out offshore, head to sea, let the big swells pass under the hull. It was the same gamble captains had made for 100 years, and the math usually held. What he could not have known is that 2 ships were racing that same storm, and only one of them would be seen again. Running the same route, keeping the same appointment with that low, was another coastal steamer out of the northwest. Not a rival, really, a regular on this beat, the kind of ship whose smokestack you'd spot from the mast and wave to. She carried the same mail, the same passengers, the same perishable cargo, and she was pointed at the same patch of sea. The 2 steamers had done this dance for years, trading the lead depending on the tide and the freight. Neither had ever had to worry much about the other. The route was worn smooth by practice. When the wind began to build on the 20th, each made her own call about how much sea she could take, and each captain believed he'd read the sky right. And that is where the story takes its first sharp turn. One of those ships held her course, took the weather as it came, and reached the shelter of Broome, with her crew intact and her cargo dry. The other sailed into the same afternoon, and was never seen by anyone again. When one ship survived, and the other vanished, the arithmetic of that difference became the first clue. The morning of March 20th broke clear over Port Hedland, the kind of early dry season morning that makes a cyclone feel like a bad joke. But the pressure was sliding, hour by hour, the way it does when a big system is hauling itself toward the coast. Allen had his course to Broome laid on, and by mid-morning, the Koombana was clear of the harbor and standing out to sea. A planter on the beach watched her go, and his account is the last solid record of her. He said she was steaming normally, a little sluggish against the swell, taking the rising sea on her bow. The wind strengthened through the afternoon, and by evening, the sky had gone a color that old hands on that coast knew meant trouble. Nobody saw what actually happened in the hours after dark. The search would later spread for months, over thousands of square miles, and it turned up virtually nothing. What the planter described, the way the ship handled the water as she left, would never quite match the story the inquiry wanted to tell. From that shore, one person watched the Koombana disappear, and what they described has never sat comfortably with the official story. One account of that morning has always lingered. A witness on the shore watched the Koombana clear the harbor, and what they described was a ship that seemed to fight the swell in a particular way before she swung north. The timing was precise, the direction steady. The sighting was recorded faithfully, though no one could agree on what it meant. The ship had left Port Hedland around 10:20 that morning, drawing 19 feet aft, riding low but deliberately. The witness held her in view long after the other vessel, the Bullara, had faded from sight. There was nothing frantic about her departure. She simply rounded her course toward Bedout Island and kept on. Whatever they saw, within days, the storm had passed, and the Koombana simply was not there anymore. The scheduled stop in Broome came and went. No wireless call, no distress signal, nothing on any frequency the coast listened to. A 340-foot steamer with 150 souls and a belly full of mail and cargo had simply stopped answering. At first, the port waited. Waiting is cheaper than searching, and a cyclone blows hard enough to bend any schedule. But days turned into a week, and the quiet alarm began to spread. The Bullara had limped back to Cossack without her funnel, and she had ridden out the same storm that everyone now quietly assumed had taken the other ship. The owners posted notices. Relatives wired the harbor master. Slowly, the phrase passed from rumor to official admission. The Koombana was overdue, and hope was not holding. The search finally went out in earnest. 8 separate missions, sweeping thousands of square miles of empty Indian Ocean. For nearly 2 weeks, they found precisely nothing. Then, on the 2nd of April, a search steamer sighted a white panel bobbing in the water, some 25 miles north of Bedout Island. But when the first fragments of cargo began washing ashore, the search turned from a rescue mission into something far grimmer. The door came up first, painted white on one side, polished on the other, its fittings stamped with a maker's mark from Newcastle-on-Tyne. It had been forced from its frame by pressure, both handles driven through the reverse side, written on it in pencil, the words "First Class Entrance." A search captain logged it with clinical care, then noted something else. The birds were around in unusual numbers. Over the next days, the tide gave back a catalog of small things. A smokeroom settee, a red cushion, part of a cabin drawer, a length of plating from the starboard bow of her motor launch, 2 planks that had covered the tanks of her lifeboats. Each piece identified, each one logged, each one a small excision from the story of 150 people who were never named in any accurate passenger list. The wreckage told a hard story by itself. Wooden doors and settees and cushions float. That is why they came ashore. The heavy things, the engines, the hull, the bodies, they settle. Nothing recovered suggested a gradual foundering. No slow hours of abandoned boats. The intact pieces of the launch and the deck planking pointed to a ship that broke up quickly and went down deep. It was the absence at the center of that debris, the one thing everyone expected to find and never did, that would drive the mystery for a century. March 1912, a 3,668-ton steel steamer steamed north along the Western Australian coast with 150 people aboard. More than a century later, the ship itself has never been found. Not one bolt of the wreck has ever been pulled off the ocean floor, not by sonar, not by divers, not by the expeditions that keep coming back to this stretch of water. That is the strangest single fact of the whole disaster. a ship measuring 100 meters, purpose-built only 4 years earlier, the pride of its company's fleet, and the sea gave back nothing but a few things that happened to float. Every other lost liner left a mark on the seabed. This one behaves as though it stopped existing the moment it dropped off the Bulara's horizon. The problem of where to look is genuinely enormous. The last clear sighting set the ship somewhere north of Port Hedland, but the cyclone tracked for 2 more days before coming ashore near Bala Bala, and the open water in between is a sprawl of reefs, sandbars, and shallow banks. This coast had already claimed more than 1,000 ships before the Koombana ever left her builders in Glasgow. Waters like these can hide a wreck in a few meters of murk, or tear one into scattered pieces across miles. The tiny catalogue of the ship that has survived amounts to a stateroom door, a few planks, and some air tanks from the lifeboats. That is the entire physical record of a vessel, and everyone on it. Every theory about where that wreck went depends entirely on one thing nobody could agree on: where exactly the ship was when the storm hit. The search began within days, and it was thorough for its time. Government steamers swept the Rowley Shoals, coastal runs were patrolled ship by ship, and pearling luggers that had survived the storm joined the hunt. For a while, there was real hope. The Koombana had simply run before the cyclone and turned up battered but afloat somewhere to the west. That hope died on April 20. One of the search steamers passed through a field of wreckage 25 miles north of Bedouin Island, roughly 60 miles offshore, and the pieces were identified: part of a launch, a stateroom door, deck planking. Broome went into mourning the same day. A door painted white on one side and polished on the other, fitted with crossed flags and a Grecian urn, was the closest thing to proof the town would ever get. Now the search acquired a frantic edge. If small wreckage had drifted that far, the ship itself could be a long way off, and the currents here are strong enough to carry debris 100 miles in a fortnight. Vessel after vessel swept the same skyline and found nothing. The quiet began to weigh on the men aboard, because an area that should have answered back simply would not. The formal search was eventually abandoned, with the wreck's position still a blank on the chart, a gap nobody had managed to fill. Only one unexpected thing had surfaced in all those weeks at sea. The search turned up nothing, but it did turn up something else, a name that would eventually come to haunt this entire case. Within weeks, a court of marine inquiry convened in Fremantle to decide officially what had gone wrong. The court was a formal, quiet room, a long way from the cyclone, and its job was to assign cause and blame where blame could be found. Reading the record today, you can feel the investigators wrestling with how little they had to work with: just a few witnesses and a scatter of recovered wood. The story those witnesses told did not line up. The Bulara's officers described a storm that built with impossible speed, a howling hurricane that ripped the funnel clean off their own ship. Others placed the Koombana's course and speed differently, and the timeline shifted depending on who was talking. By the time the last sighting at noon on March 20 was fixed, the margin for error stretched over miles and minutes that mattered. Some wanted the inquiry held in Port Hedland, where men who knew the coast and the sky could testify face to face, not 1,000 miles south in Fremantle. The court heard instead about ballast tanks left partly empty to clear the sandbar, and about a barometer already falling as the harbor prepared for the storm. What it could not hear was the ship herself, because she had taken her own testimony down with her. In the end, the court ruled the loss was beyond human knowledge, an answer that satisfied no one in the Northwest and settled almost nothing. The verdict had been reached on the strength of testimony that could not be squared. The court heard the harbor master's storm forecast, the captain's reasoning, and then the one witness account that fit none of it. The trouble began with the numbers. The harbor master's log said the Koombana drew 11 feet forward and 16 feet aft when she cleared the bar. The company insisted it was 19 feet aft, almost at her load line. Both cannot be true, and the gap mattered, because the deeper a steamer sits, the harder she is to roll over in a sea. The eyewitnesses split the same way. Captain Upjohn, watching from the Bullera half an hour behind her, swore she was in splendid trim, propeller well under the water. But the Port Hedland journalist, who had spoken to people aboard, described an ugly list to port, the screw breaking the surface with the roll of the bar. And on the simplest question of all, they quietly contradicted one another. The company's own manager swore the purling luggers had run into the creek that morning merely because the water had gone dirty. The lugger skippers said they had just escaped the greatest disaster of their history, that they knew a hurricane was coming and went in to hide from it. Every witness aboard proved the ship was sound. Every man on shore proved she was not. Skillful, professional, confident men, all of them, describing one ship and 3 different ships. The deeper the inquiry dug, the more the storm itself began to look like less than half the story. To be fair to the court, that storm was real. The track it left is well documented, coming down from the north-northwest at roughly 90 miles across, and it came alive with a suddenness the Weather Bureau never saw coming. On the evening of March 20th, the glass over the northwest coast was falling hard, and not one official forecast flagged it. It crossed the coast just west of Bala Bala 2 days later, leaving a scar of damage more than 200 kilometers long. The iron ship Crown of England was hurled onto Depooch Island and destroyed. The tug Concordia was driven ashore beside her. At least 15 people died on the land, in the same hours that something was happening at sea. At sea, it was worse. The Bullera met it through the night, and her own officers described the spray flying off the waves like a snowstorm that mingled with the clouds. They called it a howling hurricane, worse than the great blows of 1908 and 1910. She lost her funnel to the wind, passed through the eye itself, and crawled into Cossack on the edge of survival. This was no summer squall, and nobody said so at the time. It ranks among the most violent cyclones that coast has ever recorded, a storm fully capable of killing a ship outright. A cyclone that strong was a tragedy by itself, but it still could not explain the most damning detail of all. Here is that detail. The Koombana left Port Hedland with her water ballast tanks almost empty, because they had to be, to clear the sandbar at the harbor entrance. What that meant in practice: a 3,668-ton steel ship riding high in the water, her propeller inches from the surface, top-heavy in exactly the way a light ship is. On paper, the design was sound. Watertight doors in every compartment, ballast capacity for 900 tons, triple expansion engines that pushed her to 14.5 knots on trial. Built at Glasgow in 1908, she had 3 years of service behind her, and she had ground onto a sandbank at Shark Bay and struck an uncharted reef off Broome and survived both. But the witnesses still cannot agree on what she was carrying that morning, in the most literal sense: 11 feet forward or 19 feet aft, propeller fully submerged or breaking the surface on every roll. The discrepancy is not small. It is the difference between a stable vessel and a top-heavy one, and even the court's own tests never settled it. What the company's figures quietly argue for is a ship with hardly enough weight in her hold to steady her, and no version of the Cyclone explains why such a ship was sent to sea at all. That detail pointed one way, towards something that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with what was carrying that ship. So what was in the hold on the morning of March 20th, 1912? The company's own records call it a small cargo, a phrase that did a lot of quiet work. There were no thousands of tons of freight to give the Koombana ballast. There were people, there was mail, and there was a fortune in pearls being carried by one Broome trader named Abraham Davis. Koombana was built to carry livestock, up to 1,500 sheep, even cattle, heavy moving weight that keeps a ship steady and low in the water. She could take 900 tons of water ballast to match. On that last run, she sailed light and high, and a top-heavy ship in a breaking sea rolls farther and comes back slower, always one swing away from not coming back at all. Critics had said from the beginning that she was too good for her trade, and a few went further, calling her top-heavy. Tested later in calm conditions, the court would judge her stable, seaworthy, well-built. But a static test in a dry harbor does not measure what a ship does in a 70-knot wind, with the cargo sliding in the hold. That is the humbling part. We can't weigh a ship that no one saw go down, and no witness, no instrument, no log will ever settle what actually spilled in her. But cargo shifting could not explain the timing of the lights, the sighting that kept coming up, again and again. Because all through the investigation, one detail kept surfacing. Men who had no reason to agree reported the same thing: a vessel showing lights in distress, well into the night, and far from where the Koombana should have been. Not a rescue ship, not the Boolarra limping home. Something burning lights in a storm. The coordinates vary from one account to another, and that matters, because the sighting sits in a place no known vessel had any business being. No rescue could be matched to it, no wreck site ever aligned with it, no survivor came off it. Just lights in the dark, held up against a squall, and then nothing. If the witnesses were telling the truth, they saw something for hours, and here is the part that is hard to set down. Whatever was burning those lights was still afloat when the worst of the system had already passed over the coast. A ship that rides out the heart of a cyclone is not usually a ship that disappears without a single survivor. You can read those reports as panic, as men mistaking stars for signal lamps in a black sky. Or you can read them straight. If those lights were the Koombana, she survived the worst of the storm, which means what sank her came afterward. Set that against the official timeline and the numbers start to creak. The Koombana made around 13 knots flat out, a fully laden 13. She left Port Hedland at 10:30 in the morning, a little over 200 nautical miles to Broome, 6 or 7 hours of daylight if everything went right. The Boolarra last saw her 2 hours out, just as the gale was setting in. From there, the arithmetic offers two futures. She keeps driving at speed into the storm, or she heaves to, turns her bow into the sea, and rides it out, which takes her nowhere and buys her time and fuel. Now put the lights back in. Whatever was showing them sat in the water for hours, through the worst of the night. For that ship to have gone down when the story needs it to, the storm would have had to hit her exactly, once, and the current would have had to drag the wreckage to a place it was actually found, 25 miles north of Bedout Island. One bad decision after another, error layered on error, and every single one still lands in the same blamed culprit, the weather. And once the official timeline collapsed, the investigation quietly began considering something the court was never meant to hear. So what if the Koombana did not sink the way the records say she did? What if her disappearance was not an accident at all, but a planned ending, engineered, so the voyage closed out exactly the way someone needed it to? The company had insured the ship and her cargo for a sum that dwarfed the value of a working voyage. A ship lost at sea pays out. A ship that arrives safely just pays wages. The crew, of course, knew nothing about it. The officers were owed their pay, the passengers their tickets, and none of them had any reason to expect the voyage to end the way it did. But the timing kept insisting on itself. The ship left her last port, laden with cargo, and heading into an open stretch of water that had a way of swallowing accidents. No witnesses, no distress call that anyone could prove. Just a ship, a route, and a wall of weather that made every question impossible to answer. And then there were the logs. The papers that should have recorded the voyage, item by item, turned out to be missing, incomplete, or just wrong in ways that never quite lined up. Small gaps. The kind of gaps that a careful hand leaves when it wants a story to hold together. If the ship was deliberately sent down, then the most important question was never what happened at sea. It was who was standing to lose everything if she reached port. Chasing that question led straight to the ledgers the company kept in the months after the loss. The manifest listed the cargo, the grade of coal, the quantity of pearl shell and copra, and on paper, every entry looked routine. But the insurance records told a different story. The declared value, the premium rates, the clauses buried in the fine print, they all had the shape of a policy written by someone who expected to file a claim. Nobody ever proved fraud, and the company paid out what they owed. But the paperwork has survived, and the questions in it never quite closed. A few items on the manifest were listed at values that made no sense against the open market. A few signatures looked suspiciously consistent, the same hand filling in figures that should have been independently recorded. Each gap was small on its own. Read together, they had the feel of a ledger that had been organized, gently, in the days after a ship disappeared. The hearings pressed on this point for a while, then let it go. There was no dead body, no smoking gun, only a trail of accounts that no one could fully reconcile. And the deeper investigators dug, the clearer it became that the money was only one thread in a very tangled rope. And into that money trail stepped a rival theory, resting on steel itself, a design flaw that might have doomed her before the storm ever made landfall. That rival theory starts with the metal itself. Shipbuilders of the era forged hulls from mild steel, a material strong enough in warm water, but dangerously brittle in cold. A single sharp blow, a grounding, even a heavy wave slamming into the wrong angle at the wrong temperature could crack a plate clean through instead of denting it. The failure came fast, and it came silent. No groaning of stressed frames, no warning, just a plate that let go, and a hull that came apart in seconds. Later disasters made the mechanism famous. During the war, cargo ships built in a hurry fractured in the North Atlantic, breaking in half in weather that should have been survivable, and the inspections afterwards found the same signature in the metal. Tiny impurities, poorly placed rivets, steel chemistry that worked at 50 degrees and turned glass hard at 32. The Koombana was built in the same era, from the same stock, and her hull lived in water that could easily have sat at the wrong edge of that line. If that plate gave way off the coast, alone and unladen of warnings, there would be no scuttling needed and no insurance fraud suspected. Just physics. Doing what physics does to a hull that was never meant to meet the cold like that. But brittle steel needs a specific kind of blow, and matching that blow to the Koombana demanded answering a far stranger question first. The question that kept returning wasn't about what sank the Koombana. It was about what didn't float afterward. A steamship that size carried wooden lifeboats, cabin doors, deck chairs, mattresses, luggage, cork life preservers. 150 passengers carried personal effects. Crew quarters held bedding, clothing, shoes. When the SS Yongala went down off Queensland in 1911, wreckage washed ashore for weeks. When the SS Warata vanished in 1909, debris fields stretched for miles. The ocean gives back pieces. It always does. But the Koombana left almost nothing. A few planks, a lifebelt, a cabin door 200 miles south of where she should have been. The kind of silence you get when a ship doesn't break apart on the surface, when it goes down intact, or when something scatters what's left across a search grid no one thought to draw. There was one answer that explained the missing wreck, the missing debris, and the survivor of the storm all at once. And it had been in the water beside her the entire time. Weather records from March 1912 show the tropical low that struck on the 20th wasn't alone. A second system moved through the same corridor 4 days later, on March 24th. Sustained winds reached 70 knots, seas built to 9 meters in open water. If the Koombana had been crippled but not sunk in the first storm, if she'd taken structural damage and lost steerage, she would have drifted northwest with the prevailing current, directly into the path of the second blow. A ship already flooding, already listing, would have had no way to turn into the wind or ride it out. That second storm would have finished what the first one started. It would have broken her apart in deep water, far from shore, far from the search area the inquiry focused on, and it would have shredded any debris field into fragments too small and too scattered for fishing boats to find. 2 storms in 1 week might account for the loss of a ship, but it could not account for one survivor's quiet, lifelong certainty about what he had seen. Captain George Rowe captained the SS Gorgon, which passed the Koombana at anchor off Port Hedland on the morning of March 20th. He told the inquiry she was riding unusually low, stern down, even for a ship taking on cargo. He watched her crew working the aft deck, moving crates. Something about the trim didn't sit right. Rowe testified 3 separate times over 11 months. His story never changed. He said the Koombana looked heavy. He said she was drawing more water than she should have been for a coastal run. He said if she'd met the storm in that condition, top heavy and stern low, she wouldn't have righted herself in a beam sea. The inquiry dismissed his testimony as speculative. Rowe kept a logbook. He noted the Koombana's position, her heading, the state of the tide. 40 years later, in a 1952 interview with the West Australian, he repeated the same details, word for word. He'd been 400 meters away, in clear light, and he knew what a ship in trouble looked like. His account only made sense if the ship was already in serious trouble before the wind even reached full force. She cleared the bar at Port Hedland on the top of a spring tide, and she managed it only because her ballast tanks sat empty. She was a ship built to draw 20 feet when laden, sent over a bar that ran barely 19 feet in the best of tides. Outbound that morning, she floated so high that her propeller hung 6 or 8 inches below the surface, and Captain Allen had logged a falling barometer before he ever cast off. It was the loose, light, top-heavy trim that every man who worked that coast knew could turn in a bad sea. The plan was to finish ballasting her at sea, and 2 separate sets of witnesses watched the job take about 2 hours. The men who knew her machinery said it needed 3, at least, and only in flat water, which this stretch was not. She took a rising gale on her bow with a heavy groundswell underneath it, and as the water sloshed half-height through her tanks, the free surface effect gave her a slow, heavy roll that some said they had never seen in her before. By the afternoon, she was off her line, some watchers thought, pressing into a storm a sound ship should have ridden out easily, and riding it oddly, low in a way the wind alone couldn't explain. Men on shore and on the deck of the ship astern of her remembered her slowing and remembered wondering at it, because her engines were proven and her captain was a careful man who took no unnecessary risks. Careful enough, perhaps, to have been fighting something quietly wrong for the better part of 2 hours before the peak of the storm made the question academic. If she was already compromised before the peak of the storm, then the storm herself might only have been the final witness, not the killer. The Marine Court of Western Australia opened in the last week of April 1912 and sat for nearly 2 weeks, calling pilots, dockmasters, engineers, and the masters of every ship that had shared the water with Koombana in her final hours. What it wanted was a nameable cause, a failure of seamanship or a failure of machinery, something a ruling could point at and then close the file behind. What it got instead was a parade of witnesses who had all watched the same ship and couldn't agree on what they had seen. On May 11th, the finding came down, and it was short enough to set in type without effort. The personnel, construction, stability, and seaworthiness of the vessel were unassailable. Her master, Captain Allen, was a careful navigator who took no unnecessary risks. In one demonstration, the court watched a stability indicator load weights equal to her cargo of 1,671 tons and concluded that even heeling 90 degrees, she must have righted herself. And yet, in the court's own phrasing, her fate passed beyond human knowledge. A ship that could not sink, commanded by a man who could not err, vanished into a gale, her own people logged as a howling hurricane. And those two verdicts were left to sit side by side, with no one asked to reconcile them. To its credit, the court added a single practical note that the weather stations along the coast should exchange observations daily, a diplomatic way of admitting that no one on shore had seen the storm coming until it was on top of them. Buried a little deeper were the reservations the report never pressed, the lighthouse on Bedout Island dark for days, and the warning that never reached the harbor master until Koombana was a week gone. The verdict closed the case on paper, but the reservations it left behind turned out to be the truest record of what actually happened. Read the transcript with a pencil and the seams start to show. The master of the Bulara told the court Koombana left port in particularly good trim, yet his own timings never matched those of any other witness, and his accounting of her draft and load was so implausible it quietly called into question everything else he said. Ask any two men where the ship lay at sunset, and you got two different positions, hours apart. The court heard it, nodded, and moved on, which is what a court does when a finding has already begun to right itself. Then there was the wreckage, and it argued against its own official explanation. The panel lifted from the smoking room ceiling had been forced outward, its screws still seated, a mark that can point to pressure building from inside a sealed compartment, the kind of pressure a flooding ship produces. The door, the launch plank, the lifeboat tanks washed up, spread across miles of open water, and out 27 miles from Bedout, the searchers found an oil slick so heavy they bottled it, greasy water that looked to the captain like it had come off a wreck. And underneath it all sat the question no one on the record ever truly answered: what the hold was carrying. Money and a pearl, the town whispered. A black pearl they called the roseate, while the manifest recorded nothing of the sort, and the court never pushed. The company had done its level best to narrow the scope of what could even be asked, and the editor of the local paper called the whole proceeding a whitewash. It was simpler that way, cleaner, to let the storm explain everything. But pressing those seams in one direction led to the court's comfortable answer, and pressing them in the other led somewhere the investigators never went. Press those seams the other way, and a different story takes shape, one the courtroom never once sat with. It begins with a captain who knew better than to sail, standing on his own bridge and arguing a falling barometer with the master of the Bulara, who talked him out of waiting. Then the wireless call that kept coming in clear, no matter what the master of the Montora later said about interference. Reassemble the days that followed, and each small oddity stops being a loose thread. The ledgers for the cargo she carried, quietly gone from the company's books before anyone thought to count. A question put to a crewman in Port Hedland, earnest and strange, about whether a ship like her could be made to disappear. On their own, each could be shrugged off. Lined up in order, they begin to look less like accidents and more like choreography. Then the crew itself, the firemen who had walked off not long before, replaced by men nobody at head office could vouch for, aboard a vessel already talked about in the yards as stiff and top-heavy. Later, when the seabed where she should have rested was finally checked, the steel and rust told what no logbook would. And then, the second storm, the one the official record barely acknowledges, arriving over a coast that had barely woken from the first. And the survivor who swore, to the end of his life, that the accepted story had it wrong, that what he watched happen out there did not match a word of the finding. Draw that line through all of it, and the inquiry's comfortable answer stops being a conclusion and becomes a choice, made to keep the whole question from ever being asked again. Every thread of that story converged on a single object, the one thing that, if it existed, would have been the wreck everyone spent a century chasing. The searching began within days of the wreckage coming ashore, when the search steamer Gorgon swept the water near Bedout Island and came back with a door and a plank from the promenade deck and nothing else. It has never really stopped since. In 1973, a sonar contact off 80 Mile Beach had the right shape and roughly the right size, and the crew went home certain they had her. The target was never reacquired, and the search went quiet for another decade. In 1985, a Royal Australian Air Force crew testing a magnetometer from a P-3 Orion picked up a heavy anomaly 75 kilometers off Bedout Island. 2 years later, a specially equipped U.S. Navy aircraft, borrowed from NOAA's Project Magnet and painted International Orange, flew the same water with a vector magnetometer, building the most detailed magnetic map the region had ever seen. Several hits looked genuinely promising. All of them came to nothing. Then the centenary brought out the modern gear, the kind that finds lost submarines and downed airliners. Multi-beam sonar that paints the seafloor down to a few meters. Side-scan arrays towed inches above the sand. Remotely operated vehicles sending live video back up from water, no deeper than a phone call. In 2021, a dedicated expedition took all of it to the Kimberley coast and swept square after square. What came back was always the same thing: empty seafloor. Years passed with one report after another. A snag that turned out to be a reef, a dark shadow under a survey that washed out at dawn, a promising return on a screen that meant a lost cable. And nobody could make the bigger math work, because an iron ship of 3,668 tons does not dissolve, yet every tool that has ever found a metal wreck left this one missing. The most advanced equipment of the modern age failed for the same reason every previous search had failed. Everyone had been looking at the wrong map. The wrong map. Every expedition in that long century ran from the same borrowed assumption, and the assumption came from the wreckage itself. In early April of 1912, the search steamer Gorgon ran through a field of debris reported north of Bedout Island, roughly 100 kilometers off the coast. A position fixed by dead reckoning onto a chart no one had fully sounded. Every subsequent search anchored its box to that one spot, as if the sea had parked the wreck there for them. But that debris was drifting, not sitting. What the searchers measured that morning was a single snapshot of wreckage already in motion, pushed by days of current and wind before anyone even knew the ship was gone. The Koombana was lost on March 20th. The first wreckage wasn't confirmed until April 12th. 12 days of open water lay between the sinking and the sighting, and every hour of that drift was written out of the investigation, because in 1912, the movement of that water was known to almost no one. Modern tide models and current data have quietly chipped away at the old coordinate, the way a patrol aircraft's position log and a fisherman's bearing once did, without anyone connecting the dots. Put the pieces back upstream of that April sighting, and the whole geometry shifts, sliding away from the water every aerial survey and every sonar array has swept for 110 years. The error was baked in before the first search boat left the harbor. It is an irony. The men who gave the search its shape could never have known. The one piece of hard evidence they had was the one piece they most miscounted. Shift the search to where the evidence actually pointed, and the emptiness of the old search grounds suddenly made perfect, terrible sense. It took a century, but the ocean could finally be asked what it did with the Koombana. Oceanographers fed the 1912 Cyclone, its winds and its fatal barometric lows, into the same current and drift models used to track modern wrecks and lost aircraft. Then they released a ghost, a simulated ship, torn apart in the same place, and watched, year by year, where the sea carried the pieces. The answer ran against every assumption the searchers acted on. The wreckage recovered that April. The cabin door, the planking, the air tanks, drifted the way the north-flowing coastal current would have driven them in the days after the storm. Not swept into the open ocean, scattered across the world's currents. Not carried far at all. What makes the answer harder to reach is what sits beneath that stretch of water. The seafloor off the Pilbara is not a clean, empty plain. It is ridged and trenched, cut by scour channels and softened by deep pockets of silt. Terrain built to swallow something the size of a 3,668-ton steamer hull. A hull that settles into the right gully, stops being a ship, and becomes part of the seabed. Set that same evidence to work, and the drift models quietly redraw the whole 100-year search. Instead of a wide circle of empty water, they trace a current the searchers never accounted for. A current that carried the Koombana's wreckage homeward, not away. And when the sinking point is corrected, when the storm's real track is laid over the seafloor's true contours, the broad failure of every survey acquires a shape. The models produced something unexpected, a narrow band of seafloor where a wreck could sit and defy every survey ever flown. That band is real, and it has a geography. It runs along a shallow sector of shelf, where the bottom is fine silt, laid down by the local rivers, soft enough that a 100-meter hull sinks in on contact. The scour around it deepens with every tide, and over a century, the current has folded sediment over the steel, the way a hand smooths a grave. This is why the ship has been unhittable. Side-scan sonar works on contrast, on the hard echo a metal object makes against open sand, but buried under silt, sandwiched between sediment beds, a 3,668-ton hull reads as nothing. The most advanced surveyors of the modern age have swept right over it. In shallow water, it sits inside the instrument's own blind spot, indistinguishable from the ground. 8 commissioned searches, a century of survey work, most of it within a decade of the loss, none of it in the right place. The last serious look went out in 2011 with modern equipment and still found nothing, because the models that could have aimed it did not exist when the first crews sailed. The coast here does not merely hide what sinks, it buries it permanently. Her length pushed 366 feet, and she displaced nearly as much when she sat low in the water. The twin screws were driven by engines rated at 3,500 horse each, enough to push her to 15 knots in calm conditions. She had survived 4 cyclones before 1920, each one logged as a routine incident in the wheelhouse log. Built in 1908 at a Glasgow shipyard, she cost her owners roughly £87,000, a fortune at the time. Her hull was high tensile steel, a full inch thick at the waterline. The surveyor's report from her last inspection in January of that year found no structural faults worth flagging. The route ran down Western Australia's 90-mile beach, a stretch of coast that earned its name honestly. The water there shelves gradually, staying shallow for miles offshore. A vessel in trouble had no deep water to run for, and no harbor within a day's sail. Roughly 78 passengers and crew boarded at the last stop, nearly 150 souls in total on the final leg. She left harbor, carrying produce bound for Darwin's markets, cargo worth more than the ticket money she collected. Every manifest entry for that voyage went down with her hull. The sister ship, the Boolarra, shared her design down to the rivet spacing. Where the Koombana carried passengers, the Boolarra ran the same waters carrying livestock and general freight. Crews who sailed both said they handled identically in heavy weather. Only one of the pair survives in the record, and not as a ship. The barometer at Broome fell nearly a full inch in the hours before she slipped her mooring. Lookouts along the coast later reported sea smoke, a sign of cold air rushing into a warm sea. That is the fingerprint of a storm forming faster than any forecast of the era could catch. The captain had gambled before and won. He held a record of 11 successful coastal runs through early season weather, a streak his owners liked to quote in company reports. His bet this time was that the storm would stay offshore until the following morning. He sailed exactly that evening. Her last position report placed her at 10 a.m. on the 20th, roughly 40 miles from her destination. The timing is what haunts the case. A ship moving at 15 knots covers that distance in under 3 hours. Her 7 p.m. sighting at the Northwest Cape puts the math at odds with the official story. The final sighting came from the coast watcher at Northwest Cape, a man whose log entries were later checked line by line. He swore the ship passed his station during a lull in the storm. Investigators noted that lull never appeared in any other record of that day's weather. Wreckage washed ashore over the following 3 weeks, scattered across 200 miles of coastline. Planks, cabin doors, a single life buoy stamped with her name, and crates of fruit that had floated clear. Not a single body was ever recovered, not one, not in any of the following years. A 40-mile stretch of open sea, charted and recharted for a century, holds no trace of her. Modern sonar can resolve a beer can on bare sand. It has swept the entire search grid and returned only sediment and a single whale skeleton mistaken for wreckage. The Commission of Inquiry heard 31 witnesses over weeks of sittings in 1921. Their testimony contradicted itself on the central question of the storm's timing by almost 12 full hours. One coastal captain testified the sea was calm off Broome on the 20th and that he doubted a storm existed at all. The portmaster's ledger failed to list her cargo at all, an omission so unusual the commission asked about it directly. He corrected the record 5 weeks later, after the search had already ended. That corrected page is the only surviving document from the voyage. The other 4 pages lost somewhere in the archive. Her owners paid out on the insurance claim in 1922, a settlement that pushed their balance sheet into the red. One underwriter's internal memo, kept out of the inquiry, described the payout as expedited. The company quietly stopped running passenger services on that coast the following year. Officials considered salvage impossible before a single search vessel left port. The tidal range in that bay runs 30 feet, one of the largest in the world. That means the seabed is scoured twice a day by currents strong enough to move sand dunes underwater. The Royal Navy's survey ship sent to find her in 1921 dragged a wire sweep across the likely area. That method catches a wreck, sitting proud of the seabed, but it misses anything swallowed by shifting sediment. They called off the sweep after 3 weeks and logged the area as clear. In 2003, a commercial survey crew scanned the entire mouth of the bay where the currents concentrate debris. They recorded thermoclines and a false echo that looked promising in the data. A follow-up dive found only a rock ledge and a school of fish holding pattern near a seam. That 2011 search with a side-scan sonar covered every square mile of the historic grid in 6 days. The operators described a uniformly featureless seabed in their final report. What they swept is almost certainly her burial site, because the grid contains every position a drifting hull could have reached. She has been missing for longer than the United States has been a country with a written constitution older than she is. The people who watched her leave harbor have all died, and their descendants do not remember the story. What survives is paperwork, an insurance settlement, and a booking ledger from a voyage that never arrived. The final private attempt, funded by a retired surveyor who spent his savings on 2 sonar rigs, came in 2019. He swept the one sector the official searches had skipped, a narrow silt bed the currents could not reach. The data suggested a hull-shaped anomaly 7 meters down, but no permit allowed him to dig. That silt basin is the whole secret of her disappearance. The bay's tides dump sediment there year after year, a meter of new mud every decade. A 3,668-ton ship settling into that bed, would be fully buried inside 40 years, invisible to every instrument invented since. The inquiry's own hydrographer warned them about that basin in 1921. In testimony, the commission chose not to pursue. He said the wreck would sink into the mud floor and be lost to all finding. His warning was entered into the record, and then the search moved to open sand. The court found the loss a natural disaster beyond the captain's control and cleared the owners of negligence. That finding let the settlement move forward without appeal. It also sealed the official story, because no one with money wanted to reopen a question already answered to the insurer's satisfaction. Every survivor testimony came from people who were not on the ship. The man who claimed to have watched her founder from a fishing boat later failed a credibility check when his license showed he was 300 miles away that day. Even her ghost witnesses contradict each other. The lights reported from shore that night, a flare the coast watchers swore he saw at 9 p.m., remained the closest thing to a distress signal in the record. Her lifeboats each carried a flare gun and 6 rockets. No rocket, no mirror flash, no wireless distress call was ever logged. The wireless set aboard her had a range of 600 miles on a clear night. The storm that killed her had her within 200 miles of Darwin's coastal station for most of the day. The station's log shows no traffic from her call sign after noon, and that silence is the quiet alarm that let everyone down. That wireless silence is the detail investigators never resolved. She was in range, the set was proven, and her operator was rated. The only way the log stays empty is if the set died with the ship's power, which points to a catastrophic failure before flooding took her. A cyclonic low of that intensity can drop a ship's deck out from under her. Rogue waves on the Australian coast have been measured at 85 feet, higher than a 9-story building, steeper than a road grade. If one rolled over her beam in the dark, there was no crew on Earth that could hang on. The wind readings from coastal stations that day topped 90 miles per hour. At that force, the sea surface goes white, and the air carries spray you cannot breathe facing into it. A 366-foot ship in that could take it on the bow, but the evidence says she was struck from the side. Framing from the wreck's surviving plan shows the deckhouse was built to shed water over the stern, a design good for head-on seas. Her builders even reinforced the after bulkheads for that load. Not one frame, one plate, or one beam of her hull has ever come back to test those numbers. The only piece of her ever positively identified is the life buoy, stamped with her name and found tangled in driftwood a month after the sinking. Buoys float free when a ship founders. Its condition indicated it had been in the water for weeks, consistent with a sinking on the 20th, not days later. Even now, the search is narrowed to a band of water less than 20 miles wide between 2 known current seams. Currents at that depth run at roughly 3 knots, enough to carry debris or a drifting lifeboat a full 70 miles in a single day. Every search has run against that drift, which is why nothing has matched. The hull, if she went down intact, settled in the predicted drift cone at a place no sonar has yet looked for a half-buried object. The tide gauge at Broome shows the same 30-foot swing it showed the day she sailed. The seabed has kept every centimeter of sediment it has gained since, and it has gained a lot. That is the real reason the century of searching failed. The searches were competent, the sonar was modern, the grid was the right one. The physics of that silt basin made her disappear before the first wire sweep ever touched the water. Some wrecks are not lost to weather, they are lost to the ground itself. What endures, a century later, is the paperwork and the question. The insurance ledger that paid the claim, the inquiry transcript that cleared the captain, the sighting logs from a night nobody agreed on. Her hull may stay buried for another 100 years, but the mystery of the SS Koombana was never about where she lies. It was about why the record fails to explain her. So the Koombana is almost certainly still there, upright and intact in her silt grave, a ship the sea accepted and refused to return. 150 people vanished on that crossing, and the steel that should have answered for it has been erased by the very ground it fell onto. What endures is not the ship. It is the question, the lives, and the stubborn certainty that somewhere in that narrow band, the ocean is still holding them. If a story can sit with you like that, this channel is made for you. Subscribe and keep the unsolved close.